I'm Naomi Harper, 31, a Navy officer who came up through humble beginnings and earned my place through competence and grit. For years, I showed up for my partner's family, holidays, planning, patience. But when they laughed at my vows in front of 200 guests, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been mocked, minimized, or humiliated by people you've given everything to? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before we dive in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I learned about loyalty before I understood love. Growing up in a military family, respect wasn't something you hoped for, it was something you earned through action, consistency, and showing up when it mattered. My father never told me the world would be fair, but he taught me to stand straight when it wasn't. That lesson followed me into the Navy, where I found myself among men who measured worth not by gender or background, but by competence and courage under pressure. The SEAL teams became my second family in ways I hadn't expected. These weren't the Hollywood versions of special forces, quiet professionals who did their jobs without fanfare and trusted each other with their lives. When you've dragged someone out of a firefight or watched them push through exhaustion to complete a mission, surface judgments become irrelevant. They saw me fail, watched me get back up, and pushed me to be better without ever questioning whether I belonged there. When I met David at a mutual friend's barbecue, I thought I'd found that same quality in civilian life. He seemed different from the men I'd dated before, steady, thoughtful, someone who listened when I talked about my deployments without that glazed look I'd grown accustomed to. He asked real questions about my work, seemed genuinely interested in understanding that part of my life rather than treating it as an exotic curiosity. Our relationship developed naturally. He integrated into my world easily, joining me for team gatherings, comfortable around my military friends. When he introduced me to his family, I approached them with the same respect I'd give any new unit, ready to prove myself, earn my place, contribute to the group dynamic. His parents lived in an elegant colonial in Connecticut, the kind of house where family photos line the mantelpiece in silver frames and dinner conversations followed unspoken rules about appropriate topics. I made genuine efforts to fit in. I learned his mother's preferences, remembered his father's golf stories, sent birthday cards to his sister. I showed up early to family dinners, offered to help with preparations, asked thoughtful questions about their lives and interests. I wanted them to see me as someone who valued family, who would treat their son well, who brought something worthwhile to their circle. What I gave freely wasn't reciprocated, but I told myself that acceptance took time. Some families were naturally more reserved, more formal in their affection. I interpreted their politeness as a starting point rather than a ceiling. David assured me they liked me, that they just needed time to warm up. I believed him because I wanted to, because I'd seen how patient acceptance could be in other contexts. My SEAL teammates noticed things I missed. During team gatherings where David's family occasionally appeared, Jake would catch my eye with a look that said he'd registered something off. Marcus made subtle comments about people who talked a good game versus those who backed up their words with action. They never directly criticized David's family, but their protective instincts were finely tuned, and they sensed undercurrents I'd chosen to ignore. The military had taught me to read people quickly, assess threats, trust my instincts about who would have my back when things got serious. But love, I was learning, could blind you to warning signs you'd spot immediately in any other context. I wanted this relationship to work so badly that I dismissed my own radar, convinced myself that civilian family dynamics were just different from what I knew. Looking back, I can see how I bent myself into shapes that weren't natural, trying to become the version of myself they might accept. I downplayed my military achievements, spoke less about my deployments, dressed more conservatively at family gatherings. I was performing femininity in a way that felt foreign, hoping it would earn me the belonging I craved. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I'd never had to prove my worth to men who'd seen me in combat, but I found myself constantly trying to justify my existence to people who'd never tested themselves against anything more challenging than a difficult dinner party. David's family maintained their polite distance, but I interpreted every small gesture as progress. When his mother complimented my dress or his father asked about my work, I took these as signs that I was gradually winning them over. I told myself that their reserve was cultural, generational, that they simply showed affection differently than I was used to. I made excuses for their lack of engagement because the alternative, that they'd already decided I wasn't good enough, was too painful to consider. The wedding planning revealed more cracks in this narrative. His mother had strong opinions about everything from the venue to the flowers, opinions that seemed designed to showcase her taste rather than honor what David and I actually wanted. His sister made comments about military weddings being so serious and suggested we might want something more romantic instead. I accommodated their preferences, told myself that keeping peace was more important than having the celebration we'd originally envisioned. My own family and military friends noticed the shift. My mother asked if I was happy with the wedding plans, her tone suggesting she knew the answer. My teammates offered to handle various aspects of the ceremony, clearly sensing that I wasn't getting the support I needed from David's side. I appreciated their concern but insisted I had everything under control, still believing that compromise and accommodation would eventually pay off in genuine acceptance. The morning of the wedding, I felt confident about the vows I'd written. They were honest, specific to our relationship, free of generic promises that could apply to anyone. I'd spent weeks crafting words that captured not just my love for David, but my understanding of what marriage meant, partnership, mutual respect, facing challenges together. These weren't just pretty phrases, they were commitments I intended to honor, expressions of the serious nature I brought to all my relationships. I should have trusted my instincts about David's family. I should have recognized that people who never quite looked me in the eye, who consistently found reasons to exclude me from family jokes or stories, who treated my military service as a curiosity rather than an accomplishment, weren't likely to suddenly embrace me as one of their own. But love, combined with hope, can make you rationalize almost anything. I wanted to belong to this family so badly that I ignored every signal telling me I never would. The warning signs appeared gradually, small moments that individually seemed insignificant but collectively painted a clear picture I refused to see. At family gatherings, conversations would shift when I approached, not obviously, but just enough that I'd catch the tail end of discussions I hadn't been included in from the start. When I shared stories from my deployments, David's father would nod politely before steering the conversation towards safer topics like local politics or his golf game. His mother perfected the art of the compliment that wasn't quite a compliment, praising my adventurous spirit in a tone that suggested adventure was something to be outgrown rather than admired. David's sister, Rebecca, was the most direct in her disapproval, though she disguised it as teasing. She'd make comments about how I was more comfortable with men than women, implying something unnatural about my ease around my male teammates. She questioned whether military life had made me too rigid for married life, suggesting that my discipline and directness were character flaws rather than strengths. These weren't innocent observations, they were calculated attempts to make me doubt myself, to suggest that my core qualities were incompatible with being the kind of wife their family expected. The comments about my appearance were particularly telling. Rebecca would suggest makeup tips or outfit changes, always framing it as sisterly advice, but delivering it in a way that highlighted what she saw as my deficiencies. She'd comment on how lucky I was that David didn't mind that I wasn't traditionally feminine, as if my lack of traditional femininity was a burden he was graciously bearing. She'd mention other women David had dated, always in contexts that emphasized their differences from me, their softness where I had edges, their need for protection where I offered strength. David's parents were more subtle, but no less clear in their assessment. His mother would ask questions about my future plans that assumed I'd be leaving the military, never considering that my career might continue alongside marriage. His father made jokes about keeping me in line that weren't quite jokes, suggesting that my independence was something David would need to manage rather than celebrate. They treated my military service like a phase I'd outgrown rather than a calling I'd chosen, something to be politely acknowledged but not genuinely respected. During engagement parties and pre-wedding events, I found myself increasingly isolated from the women in David's family. They'd planned shopping trips or spa days without including me, then apologize afterward with explanations that they didn't think I'd be interested in those activities. They weren't wrong, I wasn't particularly interested, but the assumption stung. They'd decided what kind of person I was and never bothered to discover whether their assumptions matched reality. The men in David's family were different, but no more accepting. They'd ask questions about my military experience that felt more like challenges than genuine curiosity, testing whether I could really handle what they imagined military life entailed. David's uncle once suggested that women in combat roles were taking spots away from men who needed to support families, implying that my service was somehow selfish. When I calmly explained the realities of military integration and the value that diversity brought to units, they'd nod politely but dismiss my words with the kind of smile you'd give a child explaining why the sky is blue. My teammates started making observations that I couldn't ignore. Jake mentioned that he'd noticed how David's family positioned themselves at gatherings, unconsciously excluding me from their circle. Marcus pointed out that they never asked follow-up questions when I spoke, a clear sign that they weren't actually listening. Tony, who had grown up in a military family and understood both worlds, bluntly told me that David's parents treated me like a temporary addition rather than a permanent family member. These observations forced me to examine interactions I'd been rationalizing away. David's family praised other people's accomplishments enthusiastically, but responded to mine with polite acknowledgement. They remembered details about their friends' lives, but consistently forgot basic facts about mine. They included everyone else in family photos naturally, but seemed to forget I was there until David specifically requested my inclusion. The most telling moment came during a family dinner when David's and asked me what I planned to do after all this military stuff. The question revealed everything. She couldn't conceive of my service as a career, only as a detour from the life path she expected all women to follow. When I explained that I intended to continue serving as long as I was able, the table fell silent. Not the respectful silence that greets someone sharing their passion, but the uncomfortable silence that follows someone saying something inappropriate at a dinner party. Rebecca broke the silence with a comment about how hard it must be for David to have a fiancé who was gone so much, to never know if I'd come back safe. She wasn't expressing genuine concern. She was highlighting what she saw as the unreasonable burden my career placed on her brother. The implication was clear: a good wife wouldn't put her husband through such worry, wouldn't prioritize her own calling over his comfort. David's response to these moments became another source of concern. He'd change the subject rather than defend me or make jokes that diffused tension but left me feeling unsupported. When I'd bring up these incidents later, he'd minimize them, insist his family didn't mean anything by their comments, that I was being too sensitive. He wanted to keep peace between his family and me, but his version of peace required me to accept disrespect in silence. I found myself preparing differently for family gatherings, choosing my words more carefully, avoiding topics that might trigger their disapproval. I was editing myself, trying to become a version they might accept, and in doing so, I was losing pieces of who I actually was. The woman who'd thrived in high-pressure military environments was becoming anxious about dinner conversations with people who should have been on my side. The betrayal came at the wedding itself, in front of 200 guests, in what should have been the most sacred moment of the ceremony. I'd spent months preparing for this day, not just the logistics, but the emotional weight of it. These vows weren't generic promises copied from wedding websites. They were specific commitments I'd crafted to honor both David and the seriousness with which I approached marriage. I'd written them during quiet moments between training exercises, refining them until they captured exactly what I wanted to promise, what I believed marriage should be. Standing at the altar in my grandmother's dress, altered to fit but carrying 3 generations of family history, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about David and me. It was about joining families, creating new bonds, honoring the people who'd supported us to this point. I looked out at the assembled guests, my military family on one side, his traditional family on the other, friends from both our lives scattered throughout. Despite everything, I felt hopeful that this ceremony would mark a new beginning, that the public nature of these promises would inspire everyone present to support what we were building together. I began my vows with confidence, speaking from the heart about what David meant to me, about the partnership we'd built, about the future we'd planned together. My voice was steady, clear, carrying the projection I'd learned from years of military briefings. These weren't just romantic declarations, they were operational commitments, specific promises about how I intended to show up in this marriage, what David could count on from me through whatever challenges we'd face. The first indication that something was wrong came as a ripple of sound from David's side of the chapel. It started quietly, barely perceptible, but grew more obvious as I continued speaking. Soft laughter, the kind that accompanies private jokes shared in inappropriate moments. I caught sight of Rebecca leaning toward her cousin, her hand partially covering her mouth but not hiding her smirk. The cousin nodded, smiled, looked at me with the kind of expression you'd give a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. I continued with my vows, determined not to let their behavior derail this moment, but the laughter spread. David's uncle chuckled at something his wife whispered in his ear. Family friends on his side seemed to be sharing some private amusement that centered on me, on the words I was speaking, on the sincerity with which I was delivering them. This wasn't the nervous laughter that sometimes accompanies emotional moments. This was mockery, barely disguised contempt for the woman presuming to marry into their family. The breaking point came when Rebecca, perhaps emboldened by the group's behavior or simply unable to contain herself any longer, leaned toward her cousin and spoke in what she probably thought was a whisper, but was loud enough for several rows to hear. "What a pathetic bride." The words hit me like a physical blow, not just for their cruelty, but for their timing. I was in the middle of promising to love and honor her brother, speaking words I meant with every fiber of my being, and she chose that moment to mock me publicly. The laughter that followed Rebecca's comment wasn't even disguised anymore. David's side of the chapel was openly amused by something, by me, by my vows, by the very idea that I belonged in this ceremony. I felt heat crawl up my neck, my face burning with humiliation, but I forced my voice to remain steady. I had two choices: stop speaking, acknowledge their mockery, and let them win, or continue with dignity and finish what I'd come here to do. I chose dignity. I completed my vows with the same clarity and conviction with which I'd started them, even as David's family continued their performance of barely contained amusement. Every word I spoke was met with their disdain, but I spoke them anyway because they were true, because David deserved to hear them, because I refused to let their cruelty diminish the promises I was making. The priest seemed oblivious to the undercurrent, or perhaps he was simply professional enough to continue despite it. David appeared uncomfortable, but didn't intervene, didn't ask his family to show respect, didn't defend the woman who was becoming his wife against their public humiliation. He stood there, letting it happen, perhaps hoping it would end on its own, or that I'd somehow not notice what was occurring just feet away from us. As I finished my vows, the mockery died down slightly, but the damage was done. Everyone present had witnessed it, my humiliation, David's failure to defend me, his family's open contempt for this marriage. My side of the chapel sat in stunned silence, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd observed, but unsure how to respond. The divide between our families had never been more obvious or more painful. I handed the microphone back to the priest and looked out at the assembled guests, my head held high despite everything. This was supposed to be the moment when our families came together, when differences were set aside in celebration of love. Instead, it had become a public demonstration of exactly how David's family viewed me, not as a daughter-in-law to be welcomed, but as an intruder to be tolerated at best, mocked at worst. For a split second, I considered walking away. The thought flashed through my mind with startling clarity. I could simply turn around, walk back down the aisle, and leave this humiliation behind. I could spare myself whatever additional cruelty they had planned, remove myself from a situation where I was clearly unwanted, protect what remained of my dignity by refusing to participate any further in this charade. But that impulse lasted only a moment before something deeper kicked in. The same instinct that had carried me through difficult military operations, through moments when quitting seemed like the reasonable option, but wasn't actually an option at all. I thought about my father's lessons about standing straight when the world wasn't fair. I thought about my SEAL teammates, men who had never questioned my strength, who had seen me at my worst and never doubted my ability to handle whatever came next. Their respect hadn't been freely given, it had been earned through performance under pressure, through proving that I wouldn't break when things got difficult. These people mocking me now had never tested themselves against anything more challenging than a difficult social situation. They had never put their lives on the line for something larger than themselves, never pushed through exhaustion and fear to complete a mission, never demonstrated the kind of courage they were questioning in me. I realized that my worth wasn't determined by their approval. It never had been. I'd been seeking validation from people whose opinions I shouldn't have valued in the first place, people who had shown me repeatedly that they lacked the character to recognize character in others. Their laughter said more about them than it did about me. It revealed their smallness, their inability to appreciate strength that didn't conform to their narrow expectations. The thought steadied me. I wasn't standing at this altar as a supplicant begging for acceptance. I was there as an accomplished woman who had chosen to marry their son, bringing my own value to this union, offering my own strengths to support the family we were creating together. If they couldn't see that value, if they preferred mockery to respect, that was their failure, not mine. I looked at David, hoping to see some recognition of what had just happened, some indication that he understood the magnitude of his family's behavior. But his expression was conflicted rather than outraged, uncomfortable rather than furious. He seemed more concerned with managing the awkwardness than with addressing its cause, more focused on getting through the ceremony than on confronting the disrespect being shown to his bride. The priest continued with the ceremony, apparently determined to maintain the schedule regardless of the undercurrents. I participated fully, answered when spoken to, followed the traditional responses, but part of my attention remained focused on David's family. They had shown me who they were, finally and completely. All the months of hoping they'd come around, of making excuses for their coolness, of believing that patience and effort would eventually win them over, all of that was finished now. I thought about my teammates sitting behind me, men who had traveled considerable distances to be here, who had taken leave from their own obligations to support this moment in my life. They had shown up without question, without complaint, because that's what loyalty looked like in action. The contrast with David's family couldn't have been more stark, people who were related to the groom by blood but couldn't manage basic respect for his bride, versus people who were related to me only by choice and shared experience, but who demonstrated genuine care through their presence. The irony wasn't lost on me that I felt more supported by men I'd served with than by the family I was supposedly joining. My military brothers had never questioned my right to be where I was, never suggested that my strength was inappropriate, never treated my accomplishments as curiosities rather than achievements. They understood that respect was earned through action, not granted through accident of birth or gender. As the ceremony continued, I made a silent promise to myself that this would be the last time I accepted disrespect in the name of keeping peace. I had compromised too much already, bent too far in trying to accommodate people who had no intention of meeting me halfway. Marriage might require compromise, but it shouldn't require accepting contempt. Partnership might involve sacrifice, but it shouldn't involve sacrificing self-respect. The realization brought a strange kind of peace. I was still angry, still hurt by what had happened, but I was no longer confused about where I stood or what I was dealing with. David's family had made their position clear, and I could respond accordingly. I didn't have to pretend anymore that their approval was forthcoming or that their acceptance was worth pursuing. I didn't plan what happened next. In all my years of military service, through countless operations and training exercises, I'd learned that the most powerful moments often come without advance notice, arising from circumstances you couldn't have predicted or engineered. What I witnessed next was one of those moments, not something I'd orchestrated or even imagined, but something that transformed the entire dynamic of the situation in ways that would resonate for years to come. As the priest raised his hand to continue with the next portion of the ceremony, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel creaked open. The sound cut through the murmur of conversation and shifted everyone's attention toward the entrance. What I saw there took my breath away and filled me with a pride I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. My SEAL teammates were filing into the chapel, not casually or apologetically, but with the precise, deliberate movement that marked them as men who belonged wherever they chose to be. They weren't in civilian clothes or the informal attire that might be expected of late-arriving wedding guests. They were in dress uniforms, navy dress blues, perfectly pressed, brass gleaming, each man carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had earned the right to wear that uniform through dedication, sacrifice, and demonstrated competence under pressure. The sight of them, moving in formation down the aisle, created a presence that filled the entire space. Jake led the group, his uniform immaculate, his posture reflecting decades of military bearing. Behind him came Marcus, Tony, Rodriguez, and 6 others, men I'd served with, trained with, trusted with my life on multiple occasions. They weren't here by accident or because they'd happened to be in the neighborhood. Someone had contacted them, told them what was happening, and they'd made the decision to come. Not just to attend, but to make a statement about who I was and what I meant to them. As they reached the front of the chapel, they turned as one unit to face the altar, to face me, and executed a perfect salute. The gesture was formal, respectful, but also unmistakably protective. They weren't just acknowledging me as a fellow service member, they were declaring their support, their respect, their readiness to stand behind me in whatever I faced. The salute said everything that needed to be said about loyalty, about brotherhood, about the bonds forged through shared service and mutual respect. The chapel fell completely silent. The earlier mockery died instantly, replaced by something I hadn't felt since arriving at the church, genuine respect. David's family, caught mid-smirk, froze as they processed what they were seeing. These weren't just men in uniforms. These were representatives of everything they'd been dismissing about me, living proof that my military service had earned me something they couldn't understand or replicate. The absolute loyalty of people who had tested themselves alongside me. The visual contrast was striking and intentional. On one side of the chapel sat people who had spent the morning mocking a woman they'd never bothered to know, dismissing accomplishments they'd never attempted, questioning strength they'd never witnessed. On the other side stood men who knew exactly what those accomplishments meant, who had seen that strength tested under conditions David's family couldn't imagine, who had chosen to be here not out of social obligation but out of genuine respect. Rebecca's expression shifted from smug amusement to something approaching uncertainty. She'd spent months suggesting that my military service was somehow inappropriate, that my relationships with male colleagues were suspect, that my comfort in that world indicated something wrong with my femininity. Now she was confronting the reality of what those relationships actually represented: professional respect of the highest order, the kind of loyalty that could bring men across the country to stand behind someone they believed in. David's parents seemed equally unsettled. They dismissed my military career as a phase, something to be politely acknowledged but not seriously considered. The presence of these uniformed men forced them to confront the fact that they'd been disrespecting not just me, but something larger than themselves, a tradition of service, a standard of excellence, a brotherhood that had evaluated me and found me worthy of their support. The priest, to his credit, adapted to the situation with grace. He nodded respectfully toward my teammates and continued with the ceremony, but the entire atmosphere had changed. The mockery was finished, the laughter silenced. David's family could no longer treat this as an opportunity for private amusement at my expense. They were forced to sit in the presence of people who represented everything they'd been ridiculing, people whose mere presence commanded respect they couldn't deny. My teammates maintained their formation throughout the remainder of the ceremony. They didn't sit down, didn't blend into the crowd, didn't minimize their presence. They stood as silent sentries, living reminders that I belonged to something they couldn't diminish, that I had earned respect they couldn't take away, that their approval had never been necessary because I already had something far more valuable: the recognition of people who understood what real strength looked like. The ceremony continued, but everything had changed. The power dynamic that had been so tilted against me just moments before had shifted dramatically, not through any action on my part, but through the simple presence of people who knew my worth and weren't afraid to demonstrate their support. David's family could no longer laugh at my vows because they were surrounded by evidence of what those vows represented: commitment, loyalty, strength tested under pressure and found reliable. As David spoke his vows, I found myself evaluating his words differently than I might have before. His promises about supporting me, standing by me, protecting what we were building together sounded hollow in light of what had just happened. Where had that support been when his family was mocking me? Where was that protection when I needed someone to stand up for the woman he claimed to love? The contrast between his words and his inaction was stark, made more obvious by the men standing behind me who had demonstrated real support without being asked. The remainder of the ceremony proceeded without incident. David's family maintained appropriate behavior, no longer emboldened by the pack mentality that had enabled their earlier cruelty. They seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the presence of people who represented standards they couldn't meet, values they didn't understand. The chapel that had been filled with their mocking laughter was now dominated by the quiet dignity of men who had earned their confidence through action rather than accident of birth. When the priest pronounced us husband and wife, my teammates were the first to applaud. Their applause wasn't polite or obligatory, it was genuine celebration from people who understood what marriage meant to me, who knew that I didn't make commitments lightly, who respected my choice even if they questioned David's worthiness of it. The sound of their approval filled the chapel and reminded me that I was surrounded by people who truly knew me, who had seen me at my best and worst and chosen to stand with me. As we walked back down the aisle together, David and I passed my teammates, still standing at attention. Jake caught my eye and gave the slightest nod, not breaking military bearing, but communicating everything I needed to know. They had my back then, they had my back now, and they would continue to have my back regardless of what came next. That knowledge was worth more than all the family approval I'd been seeking. At the reception, the dynamic continued to play out in subtle but significant ways. David's family, forced to interact with my military friends, discovered that their preconceptions about military personnel were as wrong as their assumptions about me. These men were articulate, educated, thoughtful career professionals who had chosen service over easier paths, who brought depth and perspective to every conversation. Rebecca's attempt to charm Marcus backfired when she realized he saw through her social manipulation immediately. David's father found himself outmatched in discussions with Tony, whose understanding of global politics came from having served in multiple theaters rather than reading about them in newspapers. The contrast became more obvious as the evening progressed. My military family told stories that revealed character, shared experiences that demonstrated genuine bonds, spoke about achievements that mattered beyond social circles. David's family offered gossip, social climbing, surface-level concerns that seemed increasingly trivial in comparison. They had tried to diminish me by suggesting I didn't fit their standards, but the evening revealed that their standards were the problem, not my failure to meet them. David spent the reception moving between groups, trying to maintain balance, still hoping somehow to bridge the divide between his family and mine. But some gaps can't be bridged through good intentions, especially when one side has already decided the other isn't worth the effort. His family's behavior at the ceremony had revealed something that couldn't be unseen or taken back, their fundamental lack of respect for who I was and what I represented. As the night wound down, my teammates prepared to leave. Each of them took a moment to speak with me privately, not to rehash what had happened, but to reinforce their support going forward. Jake reminded me that marriage was a deployment of sorts. You couldn't always predict what you'd face, but you could control how you responded. Marcus told me that respect was like ammunition, you never wanted to waste it on people who hadn't earned it. Tony simply said that if I ever needed backup, I knew where to find it. Their presence at the wedding had accomplished something I couldn't have achieved on my own. They had forced David's family to confront the reality of who I was rather than their fantasy of who they thought I should be. They had demonstrated that strength came in many forms, that loyalty was earned rather than expected, that respect was given to those who had proven they deserved it. Most importantly, they had reminded me of my own worth at a moment when I might have forgotten it. The weeks following the wedding revealed the lasting impact of what had happened in that chapel. David's family didn't suddenly become warm and accepting, but their approach to me changed dramatically. The open mockery stopped completely, replaced by a careful politeness that felt more genuine than their previous forced pleasantries. They seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that dismissing me came with consequences they hadn't anticipated. Rebecca, who had been the most vocal in her criticism, became notably quieter during family gatherings. She no longer made comments about my military service or suggested that David was making sacrifices to accommodate my career. When she did speak to me, her tone carried a new wariness, as if she was reconsidering her previous assumptions about what I might be willing to tolerate. The woman who had called me a pathetic bride was now uncertain of her ground, no longer confident that her opinions would be received as family wisdom rather than personal attacks. David's parents attempted to smooth over the situation through gestures that felt more like damage control than genuine outreach. His mother started asking more detailed questions about my work, though her interest felt performative rather than authentic. His father made an effort to include me in conversations, but his engagement was careful, measured, as if he was following a script designed to avoid further confrontation rather than expressing real curiosity about my experiences. The change in their behavior wasn't driven by newfound respect for me as a person, it was motivated by recognition that I wasn't the isolated target they'd assumed I was. My teammates' appearance at the wedding had demonstrated that attacking me meant confronting people who wouldn't be dismissed as easily as they'd dismissed me. They understood, perhaps unconsciously, that their mockery had been witnessed and evaluated by men whose opinions carried weight in ways theirs didn't. David struggled with the aftermath more than anyone else. He wanted to pretend that nothing significant had happened, that the wedding had been a success marred only by minor misunderstandings. When I tried to discuss his family's behavior and his failure to address it, he deflected, minimized, made excuses. He suggested that I was being too sensitive, that family dynamics were complicated, that his relatives didn't mean any harm by their comments. His response revealed something important about his character that I'd been reluctant to acknowledge. David valued harmony over justice, comfort over confrontation. He would rather ignore problems than address them, rather accommodate bad behavior than challenge it. These weren't necessarily character flaws in all contexts, but they were incompatible with the partnership I thought we were building. I needed someone who would stand with me when things got difficult, not someone who would ask me to accept disrespect for the sake of keeping peace. The conversations we had during this period were tense, circular, ultimately unproductive. David couldn't understand why I couldn't just let it go and move forward with our lives. I couldn't explain to him why accepting his family's behavior would be a betrayal of everything I'd learned about self-respect and standards. We were operating from fundamentally different frameworks about what marriage should look like, what loyalty meant, what it meant to protect someone you claimed to love. My military friends, in contrast, understood immediately what was at stake. They didn't need detailed explanations about why the wedding incident mattered or why David's response was inadequate. They recognized that respect, once lost, was difficult to recover, that people who would mock you publicly would undermine you privately, that accepting contempt in one context invited it in others. Their support wasn't conditional on my ability to articulate why I was hurt. They understood that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed regardless of the circumstances. The divide between David's understanding and my teammates' understanding became increasingly clear as time passed. When I shared my frustrations with Jake, he listened without trying to minimize my experience or suggest that I was overreacting. When I explained the ongoing tension to Marcus, he pointed out that David's family had revealed their character clearly, and I should believe them rather than hoping they'd change. When I discussed my disappointment with David's response, Tony reminded me that people show you who they are through their actions, not their intentions. Their perspective helped me understand that I wasn't asking for too much by expecting my husband to defend me against disrespect. I wasn't being unreasonable by refusing to pretend that mockery was acceptable family behavior. I wasn't being too sensitive by insisting that marriage should create new loyalties, not just add to existing ones. Their validation gave me the strength to maintain my standards even when maintaining them created conflict with David. The period also revealed how differently David and I approached problem solving. When faced with his family's behavior, I wanted to address it directly, set clear boundaries, establish expectations for future interactions. David wanted to ignore it, hope it would resolve itself, avoid any confrontation that might create lasting tension. His approach might have worked if we were dealing with minor personality conflicts, but we weren't. We were dealing with fundamental disrespect that would continue unless it was challenged. I began to realize that the wedding incident hadn't created our problems, it had revealed them. David's inability to stand up to his family, his willingness to sacrifice my dignity for their comfort, his failure to understand why their behavior was unacceptable, these weren't new character traits triggered by unusual circumstances. They were existing patterns I'd been too hopeful to recognize, too invested in our relationship to acknowledge, too focused on what I wanted our marriage to be to see what it actually was. After months of tension and unsuccessful attempts at resolution, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I didn't ban David's family from our lives or issue ultimatums about choosing between them and me. Instead, I quietly but firmly redrew the terms of engagement. If they wanted access to our lives, they would treat me with respect. If they couldn't manage basic courtesy, they wouldn't be welcome in spaces I controlled. The rules were simple, non-negotiable, and applied equally to everyone. The first test came during Thanksgiving planning. David's mother called to discuss the usual family gathering, assuming I would attend and participate in the traditional roles she'd always envisioned for me. I listened politely, then explained that I would be happy to join them if certain conditions were met. No comments about my career or military service. No jokes at my expense. No treatment that suggested I was somehow less than a full family member. If those basic standards couldn't be maintained, I would make other plans for the holiday. David's initial response was predictable. He thought I was being unreasonable, creating unnecessary conflict, making simple family gatherings complicated. His mother was offended that I would set conditions on my attendance, suggesting that I was being overly sensitive about innocent family dynamics. Rebecca rolled her eyes and muttered something about military people being too rigid for civilian life. But I held firm. These weren't requests or suggestions, they were requirements for my participation. The Thanksgiving dinner that year was noticeably different. David's family was careful, almost formal, in their interactions with me. Conversations that would have previously included subtle digs or dismissive comments stayed safely neutral. Rebecca made no jokes about my appearance or my comfort level with traditionally feminine activities. David's parents asked polite questions about my work without suggesting that it was temporary or inappropriate. The gathering felt stilted, but it was respectful. More importantly, the dinner demonstrated that they were capable of treating me appropriately when they chose to do so. Their previous behavior hadn't been unconscious or accidental, it had been deliberate, a choice to express their disapproval through mockery and dismissal. When forced to choose between respect and access, they chose respect, proving that they'd always understood where the lines were but had simply decided not to honor them. Christmas brought another test when David's parents wanted to host their traditional holiday party. I made it clear that I would attend only if the same standards applied, no disparaging comments, no treatment that positioned me as an outsider, no behavior that suggested I was somehow inferior to other family members. Again, there was initial resistance, complaints that I was making things difficult, suggestions that I should just relax and enjoy the party without creating rules. But the party went smoothly. David's family managed to include me in conversations without condescension, share family stories without making me feel like an intruder, treat me as David's wife rather than as a temporary addition to their circle. The evening proved that they had always possessed the social skills necessary for appropriate behavior. They simply hadn't chosen to use them before the wedding incident changed the cost-benefit analysis. David gradually began to understand that my approach was working. His family's behavior toward me improved significantly, not because their fundamental opinions had changed, but because they'd learned that disrespect came with consequences. They could choose to treat me well and maintain normal family relationships, or they could continue their previous behavior and find themselves excluded from events and gatherings. The choice was entirely theirs, but so were the consequences. The most revealing moment came during David's birthday celebration. Rebecca, perhaps emboldened by wine or simply reverting to old patterns, made a comment about how lucky David was to have found someone willing to put up with his military wife. The room fell silent. David, finally recognizing the pattern I'd been pointing out for months, looked directly at his sister and said, "That's not acceptable. Don't talk about my wife that way." His response was simple, direct, and long overdue, but it marked a turning point. Rebecca backtracked immediately, claiming she'd been joking, that I knew she didn't mean anything by it. But the damage to her position was done. David had finally drawn a line, finally chosen to protect our marriage instead of protecting his family's feelings. The moment demonstrated what should have happened at our wedding, but it also showed that people could learn and change when properly motivated. The shift in David's approach wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was consistent. He started interrupting inappropriate comments before I had to address them myself. He began setting expectations with his family before gatherings rather than hoping for the best and apologizing afterward. He stopped making excuses for their behavior and started holding them accountable for it. His evolution was gradual, but it was genuine, motivated by his realization that protecting our marriage required active participation, not passive hope. My relationship with David's family settled into a functional détente. We weren't close, would probably never be truly comfortable with each other, but we had established a framework that allowed for civil interaction. They invited me to family events and included me in conversations. I participated when I chose to and declined when I preferred other options. The dynamic was artificial but sustainable, based on mutual recognition of boundaries rather than genuine affection. Years have passed since that wedding day, and the lessons from that experience continue to shape how I approach relationships and respect. My marriage to David weathered the initial storms, though it required significant recalibration of expectations and boundaries. We learned to communicate more directly about family dynamics, to address problems before they festered, to choose each other consistently rather than hoping that loyalty would develop naturally over time. David's growth was perhaps the most significant outcome of the entire experience. The man who had stood silently while his family mocked his bride eventually became someone who actively protected our partnership. He learned to recognize disrespect earlier, address it more quickly, and prioritize our marriage over his family's comfort. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy, but it was genuine, motivated by his realization that passive hope wasn't sufficient to maintain the relationship we both wanted. The wedding incident also deepened my appreciation for the military family I'd found in my SEAL teammates. Their willingness to show up that day, to stand behind me when I needed support, to demonstrate publicly what loyalty looked like in action, these gestures created bonds that have only strengthened over time. They didn't just attend my wedding, they reminded me who I was when other people tried to diminish that identity. Jake retired from active duty but remained a close friend, someone I could count on for perspective when civilian life presented challenges that military experience hadn't prepared me for. Marcus transferred to a training command and became the kind of mentor to younger service members that he'd been to me during our operational deployments. Tony left the Navy to pursue private security work, but maintained connections with the team, organizing reunions that kept our brotherhood intact despite geographical separation. Their support didn't end with the wedding. Over the years, they've continued to demonstrate the kind of loyalty that can't be manufactured or demanded, only earned through shared experience and mutual respect. When I faced difficult career decisions, they offered perspective based on their understanding of who I was and what I valued. When David and I navigated the challenges of military life combined with civilian family expectations, they provided examples of how other couples had managed similar situations successfully. The contrast between their consistent support and David's family's conditional acceptance remained stark but instructive. My teammates' respect was based on observed competence, shared values, demonstrated reliability under pressure. David's family's acceptance was based on my willingness to conform to their expectations, accommodate their preferences, minimize aspects of myself they found inconvenient. The difference taught me valuable lessons about where to invest my energy and whose opinions to value. Rebecca eventually apologized for her behavior at the wedding, though the apology felt more strategic than heartfelt. She'd married someone whose family didn't automatically embrace her, giving her first-hand experience of what it felt like to be judged by standards she couldn't meet. Her perspective shifted when she found herself in the position of needing acceptance rather than granting it, when she discovered that family membership wasn't automatically guaranteed regardless of behavior. David's parents remained more reserved, but ultimately acknowledged that their initial assessment of me had been unfair. His father admitted that he'd underestimated both my commitment to their son and my value as a family member. His mother made efforts to understand my military career rather than simply tolerating it, asking questions that seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Their evolution was gradual and incomplete, but it represented progress from where we'd started. The broader lesson from this experience was about the importance of maintaining standards even when maintaining them created conflict. I'd spent months trying to earn approval from people who had no intention of giving it, compromising pieces of myself to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate me. The wedding incident forced me to recognize that respect couldn't be begged for or gradually accumulated through good behavior. It had to be demanded and defended. My SEAL brothers had shown me what unconditional support looked like, but they'd also demonstrated the difference between earning respect and expecting it. Their loyalty wasn't based on family obligation or social convenience. It was based on shared experience, demonstrated competence, proven reliability. They'd seen me perform under pressure and evaluated me according to standards that mattered. Their respect was valuable precisely because it had been earned rather than assumed. The memory of that wedding day, the mockery, the humiliation, but also the moment when the chapel doors opened and my teammates filed in, remains one of the most significant moments of my life. It taught me about the difference between people who diminish you and people who elevate you, between relationships that require you to shrink and relationships that encourage you to expand, between acceptance that comes with conditions and support that comes without question. The woman who stood at that altar, enduring ridicule while speaking vows she meant with every fiber of her being, learned something crucial about her own strength that day. She learned that dignity could be maintained even under attack, that worth wasn't determined by others' opinions, that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect was simply refusing to accept it. Those lessons have served me well in every aspect of my life since, reminding me that silence doesn't always fall hardest on those who speak truth. Sometimes it falls hardest on those who realize, too late, that they've underestimated the person they chose to mock. That day taught me something I'll never forget. Respect is non-negotiable, no matter who it comes from. I didn't need my in-laws' approval. I already had the loyalty of people who'd seen me at my best and worst. Have you ever had to stand tall when family or in-laws tried to tear you down? Would you have walked away from the altar or held your ground like I did? Let me know in the comments. And if stories about standing up for yourself and setting boundaries resonate with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.